IVM.
Hey everybody, welcome to another amazing week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money, for supporting the network. Guys, you should definitely check out some of the content that we're doing recently, which is somewhat COVID related. Pawan's been doing an awesome job on the Pragati Podcast. All Thing Policy has also got a tremendous number of really great episodes about what's going on and the impact. We talk about this stuff on Cyrus Says, especially in the Cock and Bull episode. On Advertising is Dead, Varun's had a couple of episodes where he's spoken about the impact of this, as has Karthik on the Filter Coffee podcast. And across the network, definitely do check it out. I'm sure you'll enjoy yourself. And with that, let's get you to your show.
Hi, this is Amber from Know Your Qanun, and welcome to this edition and episode wherein I have a couple of interesting personalities with me. One, a lawyer from India who's now working in UK, my close friend and a good associate, Nandan Goyal. And shortly after him, I'll be having an eminent personality, Mr. Jamshed Mistry, who'll be joining us. He's a Supreme Court counsel and also founder of the International Legal Alliance. So the idea of today's episode is pretty simple. We are going to have these guys and discuss about fundamental rights, specifically in India during COVID times. We're going to talk about functioning of judiciary through web conferencing, the importance of video conferencing in Indian courts, a comparative study between India and UK. We also want to talk about majorly with respect to transcription, which is not happening in India, but the status abroad and how it should happen in India. 2020 be that year when we start with transcription in our courts, and certain more issues pertaining to the public health law in India, where there is absence of such a law, and this pandemic actually brought forward the lacuna which we have. So first I have Nandan. And Nandan, good evening and welcome to the show. Can you tell Nandan that who you are and what you do? And then I'm going to introduce you in 2 lines after that.
Okay, so I know Amber as a friend. He was my first friend in ILS. So I've known him since 2007. We did our law together, and then I worked briefly at the Bombay High Court and the lower courts in Mumbai. And then I moved to the UK, where I now work as a civil servant for the UK government. I handle their legal cases with social security and financial fraud and immigration related to social security. So quite a broad range of cases that I've dealt with over the past 3 years that I've been associated with the UK government. And I live in the city of Edinburgh, which is the capital of Scotland. And it's a great city. We are also suffering very much because of the COVID pandemic, as the entire world, and things are not exactly as nice and as cordial as they should be. So, but we'll discuss that more as Amber asks his questions.
Yeah, so from my side, the introduction to Nandan is that he's one of my closest friends for the past 12, 13 years, and he introduced me to the Bombay Sandwich Pizza in the Bombay High Court. So that's how I would introduce him. But coming to the seriousness of the discussion, Nandan, so now we've been discussing to a lot of things with perspective. And this was a couple of days back when we were discussing about how if we compare both the jurisdictions, how they are dealing in terms of handling this COVID-19. Because a lot of people in India question their fundamental rights. Now, for all those people who don't know their fundamental rights in India, please go to the Constitution, start reading Article 14 to 21 to understand your basic rights. They talk about everything. And 19 being specifically in place for you guys who shout about equality. So 14 to 19, please do have a look. Nandan, on that front, I want to ask you the importance of this particular piece of legislation in UK. Let's talk about fundamental rights in UK. I mean, let apart the lockdown. I mean, you've been handling these cases now for 5 years, if I'm not wrong. 4 years, 5 years, I don't know.
Three and a half years.
Yeah, 3.5 years. And on that front, tell me how vilified or how well does the government handle those, and what are the basic parameters, as we say in UK? Because social security is a big thing, right? So, Given in context of that, I mean, where do we stand with that in UK? We're going to come to the lockdown part later on, but at least we can talk about, minus the lockdown, about fundamentals.
Well, the fundamental rights, some rights, irrespective of the jurisdiction, actually, in my opinion, stays the same, like right to life, right to basic dignity with life, education, work, And it's pretty much the same in the UK as in India as well.
Right.
Now, with the COVID-19 situation, things have clearly taken a very severe turn in terms of how countries implement those fundamental rights, or where are those fundamental rights suspended. In my opinion, I don't see in either jurisdiction, India or the UK, that there has been any suspension of fundamental rights, because there hasn't been. Now, the entire power, or as the discussion they say about the absence of lack of word of lockdown, I think the Disaster Management Act is pretty clear on those criteria. The fundamental right of one individual or a group of persons does not supersede the collective interests of the entire nation as a whole. So in order to come out of this pandemic as a nation, we have to do a balancing act, which I think is being done, because the priority of the government and the judiciary and the executive is not to uphold every single individual fundamental right, but it is in fact to get the country out of this pandemic and get out as good as a situation as we can. The sad part of this disease is that people die and people get sick, and it's unfortunate. But the government works with a different priority than an individual right. So I think comparing it with suspension or no fundamental right, I don't think it's a very good comparison, saying that we don't have fundamental rights. So I think the government...
Why I'm interrupting and asking you that question in between was because, see, we borrowed majorly, our laws are just a replica of the colonial era laws, which you and I have studied and we know of.
Yeah.
And the interpretation is completely based on the British courts, and we still, in fact, have relied on most of their judgments to derive principles in India. Now, when enshrining the Constitution, Indian Constitution, I think is the longest, if I'm not wrong, and rather it has been borrowed from many jurisdictions, right? And that is why we have a very diverse Constitution rather given to any of the countries. A couple of days back, I was going through the Canadian Constitution for some immigration application about how they handle their situation, and it just about had 70 odd pages to read through the whole Constitution, right? Now, when we come to India and we talk about how detailed our Constitution is, you and I both have gone through those times when we studied the Constitution at length and there were judicial laws, etc. But when it comes to something like this where there is no national emergency, that's why I wanted to draw a comparison. There is no national emergency. And in those sectors, let's say right to employment is there. And you've been an immigrant to UK, and now you're going to be well ahead a citizen. So you also, as a permanent resident, I'm sure would have had certain amount of fundamental rights. Now, how well were they taught then in terms of you being granted all of that? Now, why I want to draw a comparison, again, I'll reiterate, is, well, you talk about India being a cosmo place and how we uphold our rights in today's world when we talk about law, etc., whether it's on a panel or we talk about in courts. At least the courts are doing their bit a lot. I mean, I would say the Honorable Supreme Court and High Court where you practice, of course, judges are very eminent and they know how the law is to be implemented. But the lacuna lies in the structure. So comparing both of those structures, like let's say how the government handles is the question. Judiciary handles it pretty well. Judiciary is interpreting it pretty well. Right? So what is your take on that? I mean, where would you like to comment in on that if we draw a comparison between the two, where do we stand on that?
So you asked quite a few questions in that. So yes. I'm going to try and answer one at a time. You're right. I'm here as an immigrant, and I would hopefully get my permanent residency by the end of this year. When you gain permanent residency, your rights are slightly more than if you are a temporary resident. Now, for legal purposes, I'm still registered as a legal resident in the UK. Right. And my rights, it's not going to change substantially more, but there will be some parts where I will have automatic rights, like right to social security. I still have a right to vote, which I've not lost, but that is not because as a resident, that is because I'm a Commonwealth citizen. So yes. There would be different people who come from different backgrounds and obtain residency through different channels. There are a number of ways through which you can obtain that. One part where when it comes to fundamental rights and your residency and mixing it with how the government is trying to uphold it, is the matter of social security that comes into play. Now, social security doesn't really exist in India. The nearest you come across is getting a subsidy, but there's a whole lot of difference between giving something at a cheaper amount and actually giving cash in the person's hand. And that is a really big and relevant factor here. Now, I deal with the social security part of it, and I know how the system works. And I've been doing that for over 3 years now. And the government here is trying to ask people to stay in their home, to not go out unless it's absolutely essential. And the government is still trying to do that the same in India. India also has another issue, which with UK it's not directly comparable, because the UK has a population about 6.5 crore. And India has a population of over 100 crore. And that is a big, massive difference. And we also have something called the NHS, the National Health Services, which is a centralized healthcare system similar to what they have in Canada. We don't have that in India. In India, usually you go, you pay your insurance pay, and you get the treatment by the hospital. Having a centralized system makes a lot of difference, especially in cases of accumulating statistics, or especially in cases of taking out an emergency policy and actually enforcing that policy nationwide. Although the 4 countries in the UK, that's England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales, they both operate slightly differently. They both have their own statistics, but it is still considered as a part of NHS, and the NHS operates accordingly. The absence of a centralized system in India is also a big factor which the government has to consider, because right now every state is doing things in accordance to their state's laws. So there's no effective central planning, but the UK has a central planning, and although Scotland plays a role in that, and so does the Welsh government and the Northern Ireland government, but overall the Westminster Parliament is leading the way on that. I wouldn't say that we're doing particularly very well, because up until last night when I checked, we are just short of 23,000 deaths in the UK, and these are only the deaths which have happened in the hospitals. So we have not counted old age home, care homes, hospices, children's ward, and other medical facilities. And naturally, when we later on come out with a number of statistics after the crisis has passed, the number is going to be much higher.
Of course, I'm not factoring that in when I say that, in India, what is the situation? Because of course, those instances we cannot count only. The point where I wanted to ask you again was that it really means it's not the judiciary's fault in India where we stand. It's actually more about because we've got a stronger constitution, of course. We've borrowed the goodness from everywhere, right? But we lack in the implementation structure of the government as far as whether it is any government, as far as considering how we need to channelize a plan to execute something like this. I feel that's the only difference, right? Because structurally speaking, we have a better constitution with perfect divisions into what objectives should be held, but it has not evolved since 47, or I would say 51 again, when we compile everything together to be where it should be.
Yes, of course. And that is the difference, because UK has been a country for a much longer period of time than India has. Our constitution relatively in world evolution, and it's still relatively new. It's not as old. And we are still coming up with cases. So obviously, when you consider the decade of the 50s and 60s, you will see a lot of landmark cases coming in, because all the judiciary was trying to interpret the constitution and accordingly do their task. And the one difference that really lies in front is it's not exactly the judiciary's role to get us out of this. It is the executive. It is the government's role. Because judiciary can, they can take a suo motu cognizance of actions, but they usually act when there's a case brought in front of them. But the day-to-day, the groundwork actually has to be done by the government. And because you have dual functioning of the government, you have the state government and the central government, with the political people belonging on both ends of the political spectrum, be it in the central government or the state government, especially when they're not from the same party, that also creates a lot of political problems for both sides. But the fact is, in all of this, it is the public who is suffering, and that should be the priority, because obviously everything will happen to gain political leverage over your political opponent, but you should not do it at the public's cost. And that is where things get a bit messy, because we are still in this pandemic, and there's no way out. There's no exit strategy yet published by anyone. So they have to put their differences aside a bit and work together. I've been following the news on India as well. So, I can see what's happening in West Bengal or Delhi, and they don't really sound very good.
Yeah, and the idea, why I asked you this was, since I remember very vividly when you were practicing in Bombay High Court, and given that time and now where you are about 6-7 years back, I would want to ask you that what do you feel is the one change in terms of how the courts function that you feel UK is much different than India? Because I feel overall the concept of law remains the same, but we also talk about the efficacy of how the courts operate and how our system operates, right? Whether it's you and I clearing the bar exams, or whether it is about appearing before the respected judges, etc. But what is this one starking difference? Because now you represent, of course, on a different scale and level. But what do you feel is one difference that you felt when you had your first stake there? I mean, that would define a lot about how our judicial courts are, because our courts are based on the UK system.
It was partially based, because in UK we still have the jury trial, which we don't have.
We don't have jury trials later on in India, yes.
But I remember when working at the Bombay High Court, we used to carry 10 kg, 15 kg of paperwork to a court where we would actually rely on 2 or 3 pages, but we still were carrying a lot of paperwork. And I find that is one of the big differences here. People don't rely on so much of paperwork. Your drafting skills to actually summarize everything in 2 sheets or 3 sheets of paper really is at play here, because that's what you have to do. Even if you're not drafting in your oral submissions, you get 30 seconds, and that is that you have to summarize the argument in 30 seconds. And then the judges might ask you questions. So the timing, specifically in tribunals where I practice, is quite important. A case has a limited time, and you have to finish the case in that period of time. You have to make a decision. If you're not happy with the decision, of course, there are appeal processes. But cases don't just tend to go on and on. I think the one of the cases that I have dealt, which has been going on for the longest period of time, was since 2016, and it ended in 2019. The investigation started a few years before that. So the cases tend to end pretty quickly. And in the tribunal in which I deal, cases don't, usually they are there for 6 months to 8 months of period, unless it's specifically very complicated, for which we need outside agencies' help or documentation. And even if you submit a paperwork, the judges would actually, or the judicial clerk would actually go through the paperwork and single out which ones are actually relevant and only take those into evidence. So it's hard to get away with submitting thousands of paperwork just to burden the other side and then try to win a case on that basis. And it's a tactic used by lawyers. So I've seen it myself. So I know it doesn't work like that here. Judges don't appreciate that kind of burdening. So the burden of case notes held by juniors in courts is actually lessened, right? Because that's one of the major things that, at least as juniors for lawyers, we end up doing here in India, is that we are always taking down case notes. And we're just collating everything which is there, because that's our weapon of defense and how we utilize it in the court of law. But I think summarizing is one of the things that jurisdictionally we still are suffering from, because whether it's a tribunal or a high court or a Supreme Court, of course, Supreme Court, it's all summary, right? You don't have to go through the stages of the trial like we do.
But in our trials, we've had submissions which were over 1,000 pages where you carry this whole bulk, and then, you might just need only 2 pages, right? That's one of the things. So I agree on that part. And now I have someone joining in who's a very eminent lawyer and a close friend, Mr. Jamshed Mistry. He's a Supreme Court counsel and founder of the International Legal Alliance. And also, sir has been involved in multiple facets of different kinds of boards, meetings, and groups as well. I have known him for more than 2 years. So, sir, welcome to the show. This is his first time on my show. Him being a close friend, I haven't been able to have him earlier due to his busy schedule, but now I've been able to scout time. So, sir, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. And I have someone very close as well, Mr. Nandan Goyal. Nandan, you can introduce yourself to sir.
Yeah. Hi, sir. My name is Nandan. I live in Edinburgh. I work as a civil servant for the UK government. I deal with their social security and financial fraud and immigration cases.
And so Nandan was practicing earlier in the Bombay High Court. And so Nandan, so he's had a brief history, and we were discussing before you joined in about how the fundamental rights in UK are administered, minus the lockdown in general, and how functioning of the government and judiciary really makes an impact on the public in general. So we were discussing that at length. When now you're in picture, and then we can discuss about the lockdown and how fundamental rights, which we spoke about, maybe you can give us an inference as to how the courts are operating in the UK jurisdiction. So, sir, we were talking, and this was our discussion even last week when we were having a discussion. It was about this, that, how video conferencing is important for today's the 2020 lawyer and the judiciary in times like the pandemic. So I'll start with sir first. Your comments first, sir, because you've known more about different jurisdictions, and then we'll have Nandan's take on that in terms of UK.
Sure. So essentially, I think, I look at this as more as a sort of, technology as an integral part of what I call judicial reform, rather than, this is something which is sort of, we've been plagued by the lack of judicial reform, and there have been so many reports, so many cases have gone right up to the Supreme Court saying that, and it's a continuous process. So if you see, for example, in India, in a very sort of, basic way, video conferencing, for example, was introduced, a few years ago. It has been used, say, in certain types of cases, for example, where somebody is already, say, in jail or in prison, and his bail is being sort of discussed and things like that. So those, or sometimes if a judge is in a different sort of on a different bench and he needs to pronounce an order, then he comes on video conference and does that. But the use is extremely limited. Now, what we did not have earlier was, which might surprise Nandan, but doesn't surprise us at all, was transcription. And we had transcription in 1908 when we were part of the British Empire. And but then after that, for some strange reason, it just disappeared from our system, and it took a sort of a public interest litigation where I appeared on behalf of one of the parties in support, and said that it is very, very important. Looking and giving examples of various jurisdictions to why transcription was needed, even in for an open court system, because that is what it was. Of course, the main sort of grievance in the petition was that we need to have, for certain important cases, even live streaming, and that principle was then approved in 2018 in September. But till date, that hasn't. It hasn't materialized in the sense everybody has approved it. Just very recently, the Supreme Court Bar Association has also written to the Chief Justice saying that it should be enforced. And yes, with regard to complete digital courts, I am somebody who is very much in favor of it. I think various countries have been through this process. they've said that, how would you sort of, in India, several lawyers and their clients are not, digital savvy. I mean, I think these things are very relative. Most people do have, cell phones and computers. So I don't think that's problem. If there is a problem on the network and the grid, I think that is something that can very easily be worked on. They've done digitalization of land records, so this is also perfectly feasible. But I think the greatest advantage of this, digital courts in any small or big way is the fact that you can, as a lawyer, it's very, very convenient. I mean, I don't have to keep traveling to Delhi so many times. I just need to sort of, I can do this through an office or even through my residence. I mean, how does it matter? And other courts, including China, Denmark has all its civil litigation done through an online system. Even in commercial litigation, for example, for arbitration and things like that, why should we not have, especially in a global system, the digital format? I think, once you are digital, that is, you have the video and the audio recording, it gives a lot of transparency in any case. So I think, and of course, how do you bring it in? I think the way you bring it in is through your law school. I mean, this generation currently that is studying law, they are not going to listen to the things that we have tolerated. I mean, they'll surely, they're very tech savvy. There's no problem there. So, and also say from an Indian perspective, I think it's very important. How do you become global without going outside of India? I think that's is something that we need to focus on for Indian lawyers.
No, sir, and that's on that line. Since I was talking to Nandan, since he's been in UK and he's working there, so he told me about how conferencing works in UK in terms of how the process works, and sadly in India we do face this from lawyers. Now, just for everybody out there, Mr. Mistry was a forebearer, and he has of course filed one of those PILs for that video conferencing, and of course transcription to come. Correct me, sir, if I'm wrong there. For transcription to come in Supreme Courts and lower courts and overall in judiciary. And it's only in the wake of this pandemic that the courts, of course, observed guidelines. But I'm sure, sir, that most of the times when we discuss in our circles, I have at least felt this opposition from the medium-level lawyers. I might use the wrong term, where they say that, appearance is a must. If physically I am not present, I might not be able to convince the judge about what I want to say through my convictions, my arguments, etc. And secondly, the lack of technology, sir, we rightly discussed this last time also. It cannot be because everybody in India is in fact more tech-oriented than I would say, because we are so viable on our phones, whatever be the mode of communication. So, you've been rightly on point there saying that, it's just the reform has to come through in terms of whatever way, and we'll have the right practices. And then your take on this, what would you say? You've had the experience of both sides of the coin.
Yes, and I would agree with Sir here to a very large extent. I have myself been a part of a telephone hearing because of the pandemic. We had to conduct the hearings via telephone or by video conferencing. So I've done that myself as well. There are some cases where we have a three-panel, a three-bench or a single judge, and it is obviously much simpler to have just one judge sitting there and we present the argument compared to two or three judges. And I've certainly seen a lot of examples where video conferencing has taken place in the UK. Like one of the most famous case was when Meghan Markle's case was taken up with Prince Harry against a newspaper who published private letters from Meghan Markle's father. And they took it up in the High Court. And in that case, the judge was sitting at the court, but both sides, the lawyers from both sides, they presented their arguments from video conferencing. And I think as Sir rightly said, in order to go global, you have to appreciate and encourage courts and litigants to use the technology that helps you to go global. If you want to achieve an objective, you have to also achieve every objective which assists in achieving that final plan.
Absolutely.
So it's very clear from that that should be considered. And in international arbitration, that happens quite a lot as well, because arbitrators or even representatives, legal representatives, they can't travel all the time. So they do take, we do have witnesses' testimony coming from video conferencing or by telephone. So there is no reason why it could not be expanded to include the judiciary as a whole. And with regard to the transcript, the point you touched, we have transcript services in the Scottish tribunals that I go to. Not every single court or tribunal in the UK has transcript services, but if the hearing is recorded, you can request a transcript. If you are a party to the hearing, you will get a copy of the transcript if you want. And usually at all Crown courts, civil and family courts, they are usually recorded. In Scotland, as a rule of law, every tribunal hearing has to be recorded, and you get a tape recording of that. And that is relatively new as well, because I think it came into play in 2015, 2016. The then head of Scottish Tribunal, Jessica Burns, she started the process where we would record tribunal proceedings. So even when we apply for an appeal from a hearing, when we are not satisfied with the decision, along with the copy of the decision, we get a CD with the hearing audio recorded. And that really does help a lot, because then the lawyers on either side can say, look, this argument was made but not considered, or this evidence was not presented but considered. So errors also get rectified whenever there's a recording, and there's no dispute between he said, she said kind of argument. So it makes it very transparent, it makes it very clear, and that's, I think, for the benefit of both the judiciary as a whole and for the litigants as well.
Yep. No, so and that also helps. That's what me and Sir were discussing. So we had a discussion on this. In fact, whenever we meet, we discuss about it at length, that how it eases the job for the attorney who's appearing or for the lawyer, because then you just know and you know where the case is. Whereas in India, you just keep going through millions of pages amassed and then just look for relevant points. And where you have a transcription or a recording, it's easier for you to see what the judge was saying, what the lawyer was contesting, and you can form your arguments based on that. Now, in lines with that, I'll just now come to another touchy topic, sir, and the topic is about the term lockdown. And the amount of questions and answers I've seen people posting, and the legal pundits on the web, etc., discussing. At least me, as a lawyer, I would say there is no description of lockdown in the Indian constitution, sir. We don't have a term called lockdown. So how would you respond to someone? I mean, because citizens are asking this, that please explain the legality of the lockdown, sir. That what is this lockdown? Is it even legal enough? Now, what would you reply, sir? Since you're more senior than us in terms of handling such matters, I would want your take on this.
Well, so interestingly, I just saw the notification. They've sort of increased, or rather lengthened it now till 17th of May. So yes, so we are in another 15 days of this interesting term called lockdown. Well, as a practitioner of labor laws for many years, I have never heard this term before. You have a lockout, a layoff, or if you go to court, to prison, then you're locked up. But this is
lockdown.
Yes. So yeah, I think this is a sort of a hybrid version of some certain things. Now, I think there's a lot of research that is being currently formulated on this. Various countries.
Right.
In India, we have so many notifications, one after the other, coming out.
Yes, sir.
So covering this aspect, they're using an ancient Epidemic Act of the last century, the Using the Disaster Management Act. I think it really shows the kind of the state that the government is in. I mean, they're really struggling on several counts. Of course, yes, there is no doubt. I mean, this is a pandemic which is very, very different from anything that we've seen in at least in our lifetimes. And therefore, but I think the question really is that would you actually have certain laws or could the various the state disaster management provisions, would they be able to take care of certain situation? And I think this really needs to be looked at much more carefully from a disaster management perspective, because epidemics was definitely covered even in the past, and you would have had you should have had systems in place.
Right.
I'm not talking about a natural disaster, but I'm talking about disasters like this. Say, but I think, things are evolving. I think currently, the mood of the court is kind of, much more towards, let's just write this out, let us see what happens, and, and things like that. On of course, the issue about whether wages are to be paid or not. I mean, the Supreme Court is all sorts of petitions have been filed on that. About force majeure and things like that.
Yes, sir.
So I think we, legally we are in a very interesting phase, and I think comparative law with other countries should also be sort of watched and used in cases like this.
Absolutely, sir.
I'll give you a great example. In 2008, for example, when we argued a case on abortion, where there was no law in India.
Sir.
It was we actually formulated our entire arguments based on British law and went to court. So I think this is the way the approach of the lawyers should be.
Right, sir. No, and on that front, so why I say, why I brought this up was because someone had written in asking that what do I do? My fundamental rights have been violated. Now, I don't know how Indians become very touchy about fundamental rights at this situation, but then there was an interpretation which he gave me, and that was pertaining to the directive principles of state policy and the charter of the Indian, the duties of the Indian, citizen, etc. are emanating. So there was the clash in ideology that, the constitution says something else, but the duties are saying something else. So, I mean, of course, me being a lawyer, I can draw a constructive interpretation between the both and the balance in terms of the executive taking decisions to contain such a pandemic, whether it's America, India or whatever. But for citizens to understand such a situation, because we don't have any clarity in terms of what is being spelled out. And I spoke to Nandan about it, that, our constitution is one of the longest, in fact, and might be the longest with such different portions being picked up globally from all developed countries. Don't you think so, sir? I mean, as you spoke about the national, health bill or an act being in place, because we still rely on Epidemic Disease Act. So the executive does not know how to operate because that act has only 3 sections. One is the enabling section, and 2, what is to be done and the penalty under it. That's it. There is no procedural description, and which causes us citizens also to get into a fix as to what we are doing. So Nandan, you have to talk about this and tell us that, in lockdown, in UK you are there, right? How is that being defined in UK, and what are the procedural steps which you face, how the courts are operating, and your take on that, so that we can at least educate our citizens on the same.
Well, UK, like we discussed before, UK works in slightly different manner, because we firstly, the lockdown has still extended here as well, but we don't. You're right about one thing. There's no term of lockdown which has been defined anywhere, at least in my knowledge. So it is more we are more relying on the executive here coming up and the government coming up, and we have like daily press briefing as well saying this is what we are going to do and this is what we expect the citizens to do. So they are approaching this problem from more of a practical perspective, and especially as far as the enforcement is concerned. I think up until yesterday when I read the news, there were about 9,000 fines which were issued to people who were breaking the rules, because these are temporary regulations that you should not go out. You should not go out for more than once a day unless absolutely necessary. If you're not a key worker, don't go out. But we've had cases where people have traveled by car over 100 kilometers to get a burger or to meet their friends or to see their family, which is not supposed to be done. And if you're a repeat offender, the fine gets double and triple every time. So they are trying to enforce this, but the police here, the government has said you engage with them first, you explain to them how the situation is, and if they still don't agree with you, then you enforce the law, then you start issuing fines. The public here, more or less, I would say 95%, everyone is very genuinely following the lockdown rules.
Right.
We are staying home, unless if you're a key worker. I'm a key worker, so I have to come to the office every day. But it's more also of, well, firstly, in the UK, there's no suspension of any fundamental right. You still have the right. There is a restriction put on your social life for a temporary period, because it is at the risk of public health and the entire country as a whole. So I think we also have to look at the collective right of the country to come out of this pandemic based on a certain individual right of exercising their fundamental right. I don't think in the UK any right has been suspended. They haven't done that, and I don't think they could do that. But yes, there are some restriction on your movement, and for good reason, because every government around the world is doing that. That's what the scientific experts and doctors are also recommending. We get daily messages from the NHS staff and the government here saying, if it's not essential, please don't go out. So there is quite a strong message that they want to get it conveyed. And I would say a huge majority of people are listening to them. There are always some people who just don't care about the rules. And that will be in every jurisdiction around the world. But I think majorly to place the collective benefit of the lockdown above individual rights, I think that's the approach the government is trying to take.
No, and rightly, sir, maybe me and sir can correlate. So here in India, we rather have a different approach. I mean, and many people have criticized that approach, but I do appreciate it that the caning by the police is really up, right? I mean, there is the concept of fines is not there, and we also have so much of registration of offenders in India. I see nearly 2,000 to 9,000 offenders being booked under the Disaster Management Act and Section 188 of IPC, 186, etc. So, do you think there is isn't it better if we fine? Because if the booking continues, we in any case have a backlog of so many cases that post this pandemic ends, either they'll have to be disposed of summarily, or I don't know how many petitions would go to High Court or even Supreme Court if the appellate jurisdiction is exercised.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is again coming from a stage where the police force has been taken out from its regular duties and
yes,
been put into a special sort of task that they've been given. And this is more the role of the paramilitary and the army, actually. Where you have curfews, they know exactly what is what. But there is a huge difference between, the term curfew, because in curfew you have to have a period of time where you lift the curfew. Here there is no lifting of anything. Here it's curfew, more curfew, and still more curfew. And I think
right.
that is the problem. And I don't think they've ever had such a situation. I think they're just trying to manage it the best they can, and they've been in the beginning, yes, there was, I think, far more, problems that had arisen. And the other thing that I find is this, issuance of, I understand that, the situation is changing and things like that, but, you don't need to issue orders every day. I think that needs to change. I mean, that actually shows that you're not in control, honestly. Of course, I think, medically also this is, going to throw up a lot of issues. The fact that they're not, infrastructure, for example, on medical expenditure on health. I mean, I had argued a matter in the Bombay High Court on public interest litigation in November, in fact, where we actually pointed out that our state, Maharashtra, has one of the lowest per capita expenditures on public health. Yes. And, obviously, nothing has happened. And this is all the culmination, at least on the health sector. I think they please understand, we're like a 1.3 billion population. So whatever we do, it has to be different. Most other countries don't have this population problem. China has it, but they deal with it very differently. So I think we, I think we are learning, and that's and I think two things. What our friend said was very interesting. One is, yes, well, technically, even in India, there has been no formal, abeyance of fundamental rights so far. I mean, there hasn't been a declaration to that effect. Or has it been declared as a financial emergency, though there have been petitions asking for that. So that's not happened. And I think, what he said about, the use of both sort of video conferencing and, yes, and I completely agree that, the use of even in an open court system where somebody can, I always give that example of a television studio where somebody walks in who can reach the studio, great, but then if not, you put on the video wall and, the council can sort of join in from anywhere. And I think that hybrid system would be really good, even with our Supreme Court and High Courts to begin with. And then, if it is possible in lower courts, well, nothing like that. But I think let's be very clear about one thing. All the skeptics and others aside, technology is definitely here to stay. I don't think, they're going to get the better of that battle.
Of course, sir. And in fact, I have a very interesting narration of incident when we speak about fundamental rights, where what I felt was we were in a conversation, if you remember, about 2-3 weeks back, and I was at my farm, and I would go for a run in the evening, and there was a checkpoint, and I would run in my farm. Of course, it's an empty place; there's nobody for kilometers. I would run on my farm, and there was one road where these cops were sitting, blocking our farm away from the other side of the village. And once I found that, and I knew the cops there, and I found someone who was really in need of help, and he uttered one word, and he was given the right amount of beatings then and there itself, and asked to go back. Now the point, I'm sure the promulgation of the ordinance is to ensure that the fundamental rights abeyance is not happening, sir. But at the ground root level, the awareness by the citizen and someone like this in a rural area where they don't even understand, why this has happened to them. And I would not say it's a lack of understanding from the cop side. I would say it's a lack of understanding from a citizen's perspective, because we've been put in a lockdown, of course, and you and I do understand that why we are here, and the concept of reasonable restrictions do exist in our constitution as well in such a situation. But how do you explain this to someone who's never faced this, someone in a rural area where, of course, it's just an announcement in the local vernacular, and you're being told that even if somebody is sick, how does he understand that if he has to take someone, because most of the places you would not find these systems in order. And of course, I'm not saying all of the places, but most of them. Now, there is where the lacuna lies in these ordinances. In fact, when GST came into picture, and I'll compare both the scenarios, sir, there was a notification every 6 hours and simultaneously every day, where I, myself being an advisor, was not aware of what is happening in GST, because every day there would be a new notification and you would notify someone. So imagine someone, a poor man at the grassroots level, who does not understand what is happening because he just slept and woke up. There were 10 notifications.
Correct. So you're absolutely right. I mean, GST is one such case. I think, the role of the local sort of government, the role of the politicians, role of social workers, role of people who, and even of those in, small villages, etc., who are even literate. I think their role is very important. To explain to people that, this is, see, by and large, people are sort of, law abiding for
yes, sir.
A variety of reasons. I don't think that's an issue. So, but you're right. I mean, it just needs to be explained to them in a particular way that, this is, it is, something that is there. It is good for your health. It is something that is different. They've never really sort of, imagine someone, an agriculturalist who's out on the field and is told that from tomorrow you can't go out, you better sit in your little hut. I mean, he'll think you're completely, bananas.
Yes.
And he won't be able to, but I think, sure, I mean, today it's not that he does not receive, and the fact that, suddenly you don't receive a local newspaper because it's disappeared. So, of course, I think this, they need to sort of organize themselves. And I think it's much easier to do that because again, the population is not that much. So you won't have, maybe 100,000, 10,000 people. Easier to reach out to.
Answer on this point, I'll just put last two questions, and this one is for Nandan. That we spoke about how public health care in India is an issue, and on account of that, we don't have any public health bill, etc. But in UK, you have the NHS, which is already in place. So when a pandemic breaks out, the role of NHS in terms of even telling people, I'm sure the executive and the NHS are working hand in hand. Of course, in India, we do have something like a Center for Disease Control in Delhi, but it's still not working to its full capacity as it should be. We are still under the Disaster Management Act, as rightfully sir said, and drawing most of our energy from that. So Nandan, your take on that, at least if you can explain to us the legality and the interconnection between both the bodies, because of course the executive and NHS have to work hand in hand.
So the NHS is like the centralized healthcare system in the UK. So like in India, you have to pay either insurance, or if you don't have insurance, you pay according to treatment. But if you're registered on NHS here, from a cough and cold to everything on a cancer treatment, everything will be taken care for you. In fact, in Scotland, even prescription drugs are for free of cost. You don't even have to pay for the drugs when you go and buy them from a pharmacy. So that the existing central system makes a very big impact on how the government actually tackles a pandemic like this, because they don't have to negotiate with every group of hospitals in every jurisdictions around the country. Most of the hospitals are operated by the NHS. In fact, some hospitals which operate privately also have been taken over by NHS for the duration of this pandemic, and the government will has negotiated that. So the resources of government in actually carrying out a hospital by hospital or jurisdiction by jurisdiction work has not really happened, because the NHS is present all over the UK. There are some slight difference of power on how it operates in Scotland and in Wales rather than in England, but more or less it's still the same. And that also helps whenever you come up with a policy. It really helps with the implementation of a policy, because it's immediately nationwide. And because it's a public body, we pay into the NHS. So I when I get money, I have to pay for the NHS insurance as well, and that covers me. So the moment I call an ambulance comes and picks me up, I will automatically be transferred into an NHS. There's no administrative work of transferring of doctors or change of doctors. Everything is in one centralized system, and that makes it really easy for the government to tackle, especially in a situation like a big pandemic like this. The CDC in Delhi, obviously it exists, but like you said, it's not to its full capacity, and it also makes a difference in terms of like political spectrum, because in India you have the central government and the state government, yes. And especially if they're not from the same party, the implementation of it from a medical perspective gets a bit difficult.
No, and another, I would like to come in there and tell you why I asked you this question. And sir, this is, you would understand it more pertinently is, here the Supreme Court, sir, gave guidelines to limit as to, how the testing has to be done. Now the role of judiciary in India, sir, involved, and it's on the courts to determine the price of the kits. That's something which the government, I'm sure, is capable of handling. Like an NHS system is in place, they know what's the price of the kit. Of course, it's a public body, but again, what is the price of kits? Testing will be free. So your take on that, because now Nandan is talking about a very developed and evolved healthcare system where judiciary does not need to get involved. I'm sure on such small notices. And you and I have seen that the high courts and the Supreme Court had to intervene to actually get the tests even sorted, which we saw.
So I think two important questions here. One is, of course, you're absolutely right, Nandan, that you have one uniform, seamless system. Here, it doesn't work like that. See, half all the private hospitals here, for example,
right.
Even for the I was involved because I was appointed as the amicus in 2005, where for poor and indigent patients, because private hospitals, here we are covered under the Public Trust Act, and they were supposed to keep a certain percentage of beds, free for them, in light of other exemptions in tax and grants in excise, and things like that. Now, most of them, for example, used to bring in equipment but not use it for the poor and indigent. So we, through the court, we actually had to frame a scheme. And now, of course, they have to keep, in ordinary circumstances, 2% of their monthly income aside for this. And interestingly, when I had tried to bring insurance into this, there was a lot of resistance, saying that no, this really cannot, be done. And then, of course, they've left it, to the respective sort of state governments to look into it. So, of course, I think it makes a lot of sense. If you have a seamless process, there is no problem. The other question, very important, is the fact that our Supreme Court today, to a great extent, and I kind of agree sometimes, with the government, perspective, that they allow anything and everything to reach their doorstep. I think
yes,
there has to be some sort of measure. Like, for example, from the High Court, you have the sort of the Court of Appeal, and then a Supreme Court which only takes care of matters of questions of law. Here, from the High Court, without batting an eyelid, specially a petition is filed, and that's led to backlog. It led to so many issues.
Right.
So I think they need to set their house in order as well, and in that. So let's see. Maybe that might also change.
And lastly, before we close the session, sir, I would first pose to Nandan and then I'll come to you. A lot of the listeners on the show do ask about that, in terms of this pandemic, how can we approach the justice system? So first, Nandan, I'll start with you. That what are the public grievance redressal systems during lockdown? Because I'm sure, I don't know, at least in India, you can't walk into a court because courts are shut, right? In any case, we have summer vacations approaching, so I'm sure it would have been shut. But in emergency where people feel their rights are violated, some crime has happened. How now tech is playing a part here, right? Technology plays a part in this role, and that's what has been. But I want to know from you, particularly how that works, at least in your jurisdiction, in your area where you're working.
Well, the first and foremost, I think anywhere people think of, especially when it comes to European nation, is to go to the police. But obviously the police, like Sir said, the police's major role has really changed at this point of time, and most of them are out there trying to enforce the lockdown. We have seen a considerable rise in domestic violence cases during the lockdown period because the victims are actually stuck with their abusers during this period. We have also seen a slightly higher rate in animal cruelty, for example, because the animals are also stuck there. But from if you have any concern, there are third sector organizations here, like in India, you have the Human Rights Commission or like NGOs which work on that. You can approach them, and they have a good pool of lawyers and law enforcement people with law enforcement experience who can help you there. The police station is one place to go because they are still open during the pandemic because they are essential services. You also have a lot of helpline numbers that you can call. Now, obviously, with the number of cases going up, the wait can sometimes be much longer on those helpline numbers, but it is still worth a try. And of course, if you're in a medical emergency, then we have the 999 call, which you can call for emergency. So it is not as I would say it is not as cordial as one would expect, because with the high number of cases, if you're in need of money, you can call the social security agencies who are they are giving out advance money for people for food. There are food banks here which help people who are in need, who cannot afford to go and buy groceries. And there are also the regulation brought in by the government that tenants will not be evicted if they don't have a place to go. So you cannot essentially make someone temporarily homeless. That does not mean you get away from paying your rent. You still have to pay your rent. If you can't pay it as a deferred payment. You can make that, but you still have to later on pay your rent. You're still liable for that. But if you don't have anywhere else to go if evicted, then the landlord cannot evict you. So quite a range of options for people to have, but obviously it also depends on people actually knowing what their rights are and actually following the news. And the news, the BBC has been covering it quite a lot, that if you have these concerns, these are the helpline numbers, or you can contact your local MP. Our MPs in the UK are quite accessible. That I've seen. In fact, my MP's office is literally a stone throws away from my home. So you can knock on your MP's door, and someone should be there to address your concern. We see MP's letter in our cases as well, because the MPs here are quite involved with their constituents. So there are quite a range of options to help you with the lockdown. It's also about like knowing where to go. Which makes a difference.
No, so sir, now your take, sir. I mean, at least as for Indian citizens, what are the redressal? At least we can't go knocking on an MP's door, I'm sure. They knock you off.
So, so now, so interestingly, technically, the Disaster Management Act is supposed to be, in force. You can approach, the local police. You can do that. But I think except for the High Court and places like that, I think it's extremely difficult to approach any other court. Even the High Court is also, for example, taking matters only where they think and they consider it extremely urgent.
So I'll hold you on that. This extremely urgent is something that has been asked again. What is this extremely urgent? That the citizens have to wait on their matters, and the court says your matter is not extremely urgent. How do we decide that?
Correct. So I think it's like the definition of lockdown. So it's similar. But I think otherwise, I mean, yes, we do not have a system in place, and certainly, like for example, like say calling in to a magistrate or calling in to a labor judge or a consumer court. Even, I mean, I have not heard anything, say, from the human rights perspective either.
Yes, sir.
I mean, I don't know where they are. I mean, they should have been in the forefront of this. What has also pretty much happened is, you see, the role of the NGO also has kind of changed. I mean, and they've kind of normally you would have an NGO in the forefront doing coming up with assistance, etc. Except for assistance, for food and shelter and things like that. They've been pretty much told that, listen, this is like a medical emergency. This is something pretty much out of sorts. Only you will, whatever sort of basic tasks that you have to do, like distribution of food, and that also in a limited way.
Sir.
You're permitting that. So I think, again, all this needs to be institutionalized. I think that is the biggest takeaway from something like this.
And on a closing note, so for all those individuals, we've spoken about the judiciary and the arm and that aspect. So, but all helpline numbers are available on the Ministry of Health and Welfare's website. You can just go and look in there. In my experience, please do approach your sub-divisional magistrate, your district magistrate, your district collector. That would be your best bet. Or you can reach out to someone like Mr. Mistry, who, of course, is very well versed with the online system of courts, etc., and will be able to help you with your applications and other guidance if you need. Thank you, Nandan. Thank you, sir, for being there. Of course, we'll be having some more sessions on this once I have more inputs from the listeners. But thank you so much, sir, for being on the show. It was an absolute pleasure to always have you, because we always have a very deep conversation around this. Please do write into Mistry, sir. So please, could you just go ahead with your email so that people can reach out to you?
Sure. I'll give you the email of our network of lawyers. It's internationallegalalliance@gmail.com. So feel free to write in.
Yeah, please feel to write into, sir. We have a network of lawyers. I'm also part of the alliance. We've got diversified fields. Please do write in there. Nandan, on your front, thank you so much for sparing about your time, at least from your side of the world. And I hope you keep safe. And any last take, and please also, if anybody wants to reach out to Nandan to know more about how UK works, because we do have a lot of students who listen in and probably looking to do an LLM, and then you can guide them. So your ID also would make a huge difference. So I would love you to please give out your ID as well so people can reach out to you.
My ID is nandangoyal at gmail.com.
Yep. So guys, please do. You've got the IDs there. For any queries and questions other than that, you can write into me on contact@amranaventures.com. And thank you so much for listening to the episode. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, Nandan. And I hope this was useful to all of us.
Okay. Thank you.
Advertising is dead. Yep, you heard me right. Advertising is dead. We're all in the content business now. Let's not call it news, TV, radio, etc., etc. It's all content, and we're in the middle of this weirdly exciting phase where all the borders and lines that have been drawn over decades has been swept away by this lovely thing called the internet. We're a show where we don't dwell on just the stuff that is now, but rather the wider stuff about advertising, media, content, and the whole goddamn circus surrounding it. Tune in every Tuesday for our weekly unboxing of the mystery box we used to call advertising. I'm Varun Dugirala, co-founder and content chief at The Glitch, and this is my new podcast, Advertising is Dead.
Hi, my name is Anupam Gupta. I'm B50 on Twitter. I am the host of Paisa Vaisa, the show that talks money. On my show, I speak to experts from every field of money and finance, from stock markets, equities, debt funds, credit cards, life insurance, every possible area of money and finance that you can think of. We even did an episode on cryptocurrency. I've got fantastic guests from mutual funds to personal finance experts everywhere. Robo-advisory, startups, just name it, we've got it. At Paisa, we help you make smart decisions about money. You work hard for money. Now make your money work hard for you. New episodes out every Monday, and you can listen to my show on the IVM Podcast app or any other podcasting app that you have.